Many people think slavery ended on September 22, 1862, the date Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. In reality, many slaves were not freed until much later, when news of the proclamation reached their towns.
The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor.
Historically, blacks were not free with any kind of communication from the government until June 19th.
Juneteenth is the day in which enslaved individuals in Texas learned that they were free.
Juneteenth is a day to pause and to reflect and to really assess where we are.
When the announcement was made, the slaves began right away to celebrate and being thankful to God for being free.
There was a time when we were not free to do what we wanted to do, couldn't go and come, families were destroyed and broken up.
I think there's a lot of confusion today amongst the younger generation about what Juneteenth is and who celebrates Juneteenth.
Every year on June 19th, African Americans in Texas gather to celebrate the Juneteenth holiday. The 19th of June is a special day, a day representing freedom from slavery. It all began in 1865 when Union soldiers led by Major General Gordon Granger landed at Galveston, Texas. There, Granger stood outside Ashton Villa and announced that the Civil War had ended and that the enslaved were now free. This was 2.5 years after President Abraham Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation. Granger's general order would finally free the last 250,000 slaves whose bondage had been essentially unaffected by Lincoln's proclamation.
Galveston was a very important place. It was like New York City. Galveston was a metropolis.
Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, as important as it was then, and in some ways it's become even more important as a statement of the United States since that time, it really was symbolic in many ways, because when he issued it in January 1863, it did not go into effect. In other words, the South, or the Confederates, did not free their slaves at that time.
It had little effect in Texas because communication got there kind of slow. There were no federal troops in this part of the nation, so there was nobody to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation.
The issue here in Texas is that the Union Army was not in control, and slaves were not fools, and they were not suicidal. So to get up and walk off the plantation Indeed, if you were successful in escaping, that was one story. But generally, the powers that be still control and could still marshal a force to recapture and perhaps mutilate the slave in one way or another, if not kill.
No one knows for sure why it took 2.5 years for this news to reach Texas. Some believe that the news was deliberately withheld to maintain the labor force on the plantations. Slaves in Texas worked mostly in East Texas and near the Gulf Coast. Slavery was also common in the Austin area and in Galveston.
In East Texas, slavery there was very similar to what we think of slavery as having been in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, those kinds of places, that slaves lived on plantations and so forth.
It was work from sun up to sundown, no pay. Food was what they could scrounge up, or they kept them happy, giving them chitlins, what we call chitlins, pig bellies, the skin, which we made cracklings. They lived in slave quarters. Most of them had dirt floors.
Elsewhere in Texas, depending on the type of occupations and things, slaves worked a wide range.